I have a great pleasure to introduce Emma Ashford, the senior fellow with Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at Stimson. She's also a frequent columnist at Foreign Policy. She's author of a book that I like on petrostates and another recent book on American Grand Strategy that, and her presentation today will essentially talk about this book and her take on American Grand Strategy. The timing is excellent because about 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration published its new grand strategy, the new national security strategy. So we have to compare the take of Emma with what's the current official strategies. So it will be interesting to see similarities and differences, which will help us have a very fruitful discussion. Emma, well, I'm delighted to have you with us, and I would want to welcome you on behalf of the Mackinder Forum, and we're really looking forward to hear your take on US Grand Strategy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate you all taking the time out of your schedules to attend. So as Athanasius suggested, I have a new book out relating to US Grand Strategy. It is, of course, an incredibly interesting time to be working on questions of US Grand Strategy and what it looks like going forward. So I'm mostly going to talk about that book here. But as he says, I imagine the Q&A will turn pretty quickly to the national security strategy, which has some areas of overlap with my prescriptions in this book, and then some areas where it diverges pretty strongly. So it should be interesting to discuss. But first, to talk about the book. When I give talks about the book, usually I have been starting with a quote, and I suspect that folks on this call probably know who actually said this quote. So the quote is, "It's not normal for the world to have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. Eventually, you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world." And when I give talks to lay people or students, I usually ask if they, do they have any idea who said this? Now, folks on this call who track some of these issues probably know that this was Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, that said this back in February. That's not the most common answer that I get from, students and others. Mostly people suggest that this quote about, the end of unipolarity and a multipolar future, they suggest, well, it must have been said by Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, or maybe it was John Mearsheimer, right? So the answers are very much at odds with who actually said this. And I think that's partly because it is highly unusual for a US Secretary of State to admit that the US might be anything other than the unchallenged global hegemon. It's in many ways an admission that the US probably is no longer the indispensable nation. And I think it's in many ways almost unthinkable that we would have seen previous Secretary of States in recent administrations having said this. I also tend to think that this is actually a pretty accurate diagnosis of the world. I think the unipolar moment is over, and we're emerging into something else. The second quote that I use at the start of the book comes from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist. When he was locked up in a fascist prison cell in the 1930s in Italy, he wrote prison diaries, like all good political revolutionaries did. And one of the most infamous quotes that came out of these diaries was his assertion that when it came to Italian politics and European politics more broadly, the old world is dying, but the new world was not yet born. And in the meantime, a variety of morbid symptoms might be expected to appear. Sometimes people say, this is the time of monsters between these two states. And the reason that I use that quote at the start of the book is because I think that's also a pretty accurate diagnosis, even though it was said almost 100 years ago. I think it's a pretty accurate diagnosis of our current moment in foreign policy. The unipolar moment is over. US foreign policy, as it has been construed for the last 30 years of a bipartisan consensus around US primacy and liberal internationalism, I think that is also dead, and folks in Washington increasingly recognize it. But what is going to replace that? That is the open question. And so what I try and do in this book is sort of three big things, right? So first, talk a little bit about how we got here to this moment in 2025, talk a little bit about what might be emerging, both in terms of the world itself, polarity, and in terms of the US foreign policy debate that we're having. And then the back half of the book is sort of my prescription for a more realist strategy for this emerging world. So with that said, let me dive into some of those points in the book. And I start by talking about the unipolar moment, right? Because that Rubio quote at the start, a lot of this debate, you see it in the pages of Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, is framed in terms of, whether the unipolar moment is over, is unipolarity over? The unipolar moment, again, as folks on this call probably know, is one of the shorthands for this period of unprecedented US power and global influence that emerges after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think in many ways, we actually have a tendency to sort of forget or overlook how historically unusual this was. The notion that America's biggest superpower competitor would just collapse and go away overnight. No major power war, no significant disaster, just America left standing alone. This is historically incredibly unusual in world history. And what it created was a very unusual set of circumstances in which the United States had basically no great power competitors that could challenge it. And as Graham Allison puts it, I think very accurately, the whole world became America's sphere of influence. We could pretty much go anywhere and do anything we wanted. Now, maybe we wouldn't succeed, but there was nobody to oppose us. There were no constraints. A more important question about the unipolar moment, I think, is what US policymakers did with that power and freedom of maneuver. And in the early 1990s, we get a variety of debates about what America's post-Cold War strategy should be, right? If the Cold War could be summed up as America pursuing a strategy of containment in some form, then the post-Cold War period would have to be something different. And the way that I characterize this in the book, because, in a short, there's going to be some great history books written on this, but in a short chapter, you've got to sort of try and sum it up a little. I think that what ends up taking the fore is not just, as we know, this bipartisan sort of marriage of liberal internationalism and neoconservatism, but also, in effect, the importation of transformation into American foreign policy. So the notion that America was going to take the advantages conferred by the unipolar moment, by this period of unprecedented power, and we were going to use them to lock in those advantages. Now, there are a lot of different theories of transformation that emerge in the 1990s and after, and I talk a little bit about some of these in the book, but just to list a few here, right? So the notion, the Eikenberry-style notion that we could make liberal order and institutions endure, the notion that globalization would make conflict less likely, the Bush administration's freedom agenda, right? Democracy will make us more peaceful. Even the notion espoused in sort of the Cheney-Wolfowitz 1992 defense planning guidance that we could lock in US military primacy and make certain that no hegemon ever rose to challenge the US. So for me, what I see in this unipolar moment is that all of these are theories of transformation. They're all very ambitious. They're all about how we are going to try and lock in our advantages. The other thing they all have in common, of course, is that they failed. And I think from this point in history, we can look back and we can say that we have not seen the creation of a set of enduring liberal institutions that outlast US power. We have not seen America able to suppress the rise of peer hegemons, right? If nothing else, China's rise disproves that notion. And we have seen the limits and constraints that there are on America's exercise of power with the failures in the war on terror and elsewhere. So this is in many ways a discussion of why we're having such an active debate about US foreign policy right now. But it's not the only reason, right? Because polarity really isn't about success or failure. It's about large-scale shifts in power in the international system. And so in the second section of the book, what I try and get into is these power shifts and what we might learn from the existing data. What can we extrapolate about the world that we might be entering, right? And I think the first thing that's very important to point out is that this is a period of US relative decline. This is not a period of US decline in absolute terms. Other countries, particularly China, but also others, are rising to meet us. And that is a very different thing than saying that US power is in absolute decline. I tend to focus in on a few of these big features in the international system to make the argument that what is emerging is a form of multipolarity, of unbalanced multipolarity. I think, again, we've seen a very active debate about whether the new world is going to look more like a US-China bipolar competition or a more multipolar order. I argue in the book that so much depends on your choice of metrics, that this is a little bit in the eye of the beholder in any case. But my bottom line, the argument that I'll make to you is that I think we're entering this period of mixed multipolarity where the US and China are the most important powers, but they're embedded in a system of regional powers, middle powers, everything from Turkey to Brazil to the United Kingdom to Australia to South Korea, right? Middle powers, the Gulf states, who have the ability to influence affairs in their regions, who are the states that China and the US are going to have to work with and through. And unlike the Cold War, these middle states are a lot more flexible in their orientation, right? They're not locked into two exactly competing, clearly delineated alliance blocks. One other way to think about this might be that during the Cold War, we had this non-aligned movement. It was sort of less than 15% of global power and influence. Now, many, many more countries have that inclination to be, if not non-aligned, then at least multi-aligned or multi-vector or working with both sides. And so for me, this is a multipolar world that I see emerging. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for the United States. I think there's been a very long-standing assumption that multipolarity is less stable and more dangerous. I do not believe this is necessarily true. We have a tendency, I think, to oversimplify on the basis that the Cold War ended peacefully and the 1930s ended not peacefully. But recency bias is a real thing. And I think if we look more broadly at the sweep of history, there have been both stable and unstable multipolar systems, and bipolar systems are actually relatively rare. So I don't think multipolarity is necessarily a death sentence for the United States. It may entail different risks. And this is something policymakers are going to have to really think about going forward. So the argument that I make in the book is that multipolarity actually offers a lot of potential for the United States if policymakers can seize it. This may be quite difficult. It's going to be very hard to abandon, let's call it the unipolar mindset, the notion of America as the indispensable nation. We have, I think, in the last two administrations, in this administration and the last one, seen different efforts to try and adapt to a changing world. With the Biden administration, what we saw was the attempt to weld the world into two blocks, much like the Cold War, the notion that we could build an alliance of advanced industrial democracies that squares off against an axis of upheaval or aggressors, and that would help the US to balance out its relative decline. So in effect, add the capabilities of our allies to our own, and suddenly we're strong enough again to compete with China and other states. During the Biden administration, I think we also saw the limits of that strategy, right? Limits in coherence among either of these two blocks, limits in how much the United States can persuade others to come along with it on questions like, let's say, Ukraine sanctions on Russia. And so this strategy, I think, foundered in many ways. In the current Trump administration, we're seeing much more of a return to a very unilateral, assertive US foreign policy, but one that really is focused on coercion over cooperation. And I think we're also already seeing, even though we're only a year into this administration, how difficult that is. The approach that I advocate in the book is not a new approach, right? It's certainly not to folks in the Mackinder Forum. I argue that rather than either of these approaches to the world, the US needs to return to a more realist strategy in the world. And that is, I think, perhaps a lot easier said than done. But it is something that we have seen in the last 30 years, American foreign policy tilt very strongly towards the idealist pole, abandoning many of the core tenets of realism. And as our freedom of maneuver diminishes in this emerging world, we are going to need to bend back towards some of these realist principles that have guided us in past decades and even past centuries, right? So these are not ideas, realist ideas are not alien to the American political project. You only have to look as far back as, George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War, or Nixon or Eisenhower, to see these principles put into practice. So in a nutshell, a more realist approach to this emerging world would involve some key principles, right? First of all, policymakers will need to conceive of US interests much more narrowly than they have. And that means moving away, for the most part, from these transformative impulses, but it also means focusing in on national interests rather than necessarily the interests of US and its allies, right? So moving away from the notion of global good towards the notion of national good. Policymakers will also have to prioritize among threats and assess whether things are genuinely threats. Again, during the unipolar moment, not only was there an inclination towards threat inflation, but America had the freedom and the capabilities to say, well, we're going to have a military that's capable of fighting, two major power wars at the same time, two contingencies. Now that our resources are more limited and we're facing genuine challenges from states like China, we're going to have to learn to prioritize which threats are actually the most important. What are we preparing for? Just to give you some examples, so I've heard folks in DC say that each of these is a prime national security interest for the United States. So Chinese influence over the Panama Canal, Moldova's ability to join NATO, and governance outcomes in Tunisia, right? They're all core US national interests, as I have been told by people over the years. That is simply not true, right? The first one is an important interest. The second one is marginal. The third one doesn't even feature if we're talking about US core national interests, about prosperity, about security. We need to get better at thinking about that and about being clear that not everything is a core interest. Policymakers also need to think a lot more clearly about crisis flashpoints in order to avoid war between the great powers. This is a dynamic that I think we have seen very clearly play out in Ukraine over the last few years. During the unipolar moment, America pushed right up to the borders of its major potential competitors, and we have seen the reaction to that in many ways destabilizing regions, right? So the war in Ukraine, not entirely the result of NATO expansion, but does owe a lot to the notion that Russia does not wish to see Ukraine slip out of its sphere of influence. We see similar dynamics over Taiwan. And policymakers need to consider how they manage these alliances or partnerships. Mostly they're not real alliances, they're actually just informal partnerships. We need to think about how we manage those in a period where there are other great powers that can actually threaten the United States, and in particular that are nuclear armed. For cases like Taiwan or Ukraine, the best approach for policymakers is to embrace self-defense by these states and ambiguity on the part of the US. We want these states to be able to defend themselves, not to rely heavily on US forward deterrence that might actually create the conflict that we're trying to avoid. And this brings me to a final point. Perhaps the most difficult or challenging part of reorienting US foreign policy in a more realist direction is going to be rethinking America's sprawling network of alliances and dependence. We have, again, spent 30 years expanding America's alliances quite dramatically from where they were at the end of the Cold War, with some quite problematic results for things like extended deterrence, and that has in many ways decoupled existing alliances from core national US security interests, right? It is much easier to make an argument for why the United States has an interest in seeing that all of Europe is not conquered by a revisionist Russia, or why German industry should not fall to a hegemon, it's much harder to make the case that Estonia is pivotal to US security. Our alliances are out of whack with where our actual interests are. One of the ways, perhaps the most effective way to solve this, is to focus heavily on burden shifting and burden sharing, right? So bolstering the military capabilities of friendly states, focusing instead of expanding American alliance networks with concrete security guarantees, focus on flexibility and self-defense in ways that lets America be more flexible going forward, right? Even if we are still within some of these alliances, such as NATO, not being the front line of defense offers possibilities for US policymakers to kind of try and resolve this gap that has arisen between our actual commitments and the credibility of those commitments. In practice, and I'm just going to say this in one sentence and then you can argue more about it later, right? Step back to a large extent from Europe and the Middle East, lean in on Asia is almost certainly how this will play out in practice. Before I quickly wrap up, let me add two more things. So first is I want to add a word on economic statecraft, because I think, realists have long been accused of not caring as much about economics. I think this is true. And I think especially given the kind of competition that we are seeing in a more multipolar world, it is a mistake not to consider the economic dimension. The news is not all good on economic statecraft, or not at all good. There's been an unfortunate turn, I think, against trade, right as it becomes one of America's most valuable tools. There are certainly flaws with the way that unfettered globalization was conducted during the unipolar moment. But throwing the baby out with the bathwater, there are ways to address supply chain concerns and other economic coercion issues that don't necessarily involve dismantling an entire global trading system. And America has in recent years really doubled down on coercive economic statecraft, right? Sanctions, tariffs, export controls. We use these to coerce other states into doing the things that we want, while pulling back on the more attractive parts of our economy. America is an innovative, open, attractive, advanced economy. We want other states to engage with us on that basis, not because we are threatening them or blockading their exports, let's say, just for a random example. So the economic statecraft dimension of this is important. And when I say lean in on Asia, I think it's important to point out that that has to be a key component of our strategy towards Asia. And I think, to its credit, this is something the national security strategy actually gets right. So let me just wrap up here by saying that I think, if I could indulge my inner Scottish Presbyterian, I think that, I often think when I think about US foreign policy, I think about the Gospel of Matthew and the temptation of Christ. So in that book, Satan takes Jesus, he puts him through all these temptations and trials. One of them is he takes him up to a high mountain and he shows him all the nations of the world. And he says, these can all be yours if you just worship me. He tempts him by offering him the world to do with as he likes. And, Jesus resists, and that's a different story. But I think that US policymakers in the post-Cold War period, in the early 1990s, I think they were offered the world. I think they saw the world spread out below them, and they did a much poorer job of resisting that temptation, right? We have very much leaned in trying to shape the world, transform it, make it ours. And I think what we are now seeing is the limits of that approach to the world. And as the world changes, I think the risk is very real that if we continue to pursue that very expansive, transformative approach to the world, we will overextend, we will overreach, and we may see ourselves actually decline rather than just in relative terms. So the core argument of this book is that change in foreign policy is badly needed. I have one version of how that could be done in this book. I think it's the best strategy, obviously, but I think there are plenty of other options as well. But I do think that the biggest mistake for American policymakers would be to resist change. I think we are now entering this period where change is absolutely necessary and needs to happen regardless of what direction it moves in. So I will stop there and turn it back to you, Athanasius. Thanks.